For a long time, perhaps for centuries, people have dreamed of flying. And just over 100 years ago, we took those first steps towards heavier-than-air flight. Others have dreamed of touching the moon, the other planets, including Mars, and going to the stars. We have begun that journey. But where it's going to take us and how and when, we don't know. The question is, will that path resemble the early one, the one that got us into the air? Or will it be significantly different, especially as it involves ordinary people like us? So that's our topic tonight. The genesis of this topic came when it was determined that the convention was going to be here in Dayton, and those of us that live in this area said, well, that's great, because the Dayton area is rich in history, in tradition, and in current work in aviation and aerospace. So what better place to ask questions like this? On our panel tonight are four distinguished guests. We have Dr. Janet Bednarek from the University of Dayton. She is a professor of history, and among other things that she's written is Dreams of Flight, a history of general aviation. We have T.A. Heppenheimer. T.A. has written a lot of books, but among them are two Turbulent Skies about commercial aviation history and A Brief History of Flight. Another person on our panel is Tim Gaffney. Those of you that lived here in Dayton for a while know Tim, or have heard of Tim. He's an aviation writer and photographer, and currently is the editor and publisher of aviationdaily.com.
Aviation Dayton.
Aviation Dayton, excuse me. I knew I would say that. That's what happens when you're from Cincinnati. And we also have Jeff Faust, who is the editor and publisher of the Space Review, which is an excellent way to stay up with the times and what's going on in the area of new space and both technical and non-technical aspects of that. So I'm hoping that we can have a really good discussion. The format is going to be this. I'm going to give each of the panelists a few minutes in turn to introduce themselves a little bit of their history, what their current interests are, and if they have a general perspective on the topic of is aviation history repeating itself, to tell us what that is. Where are they coming from? And then we'll go for some questions. And if you don't have questions, I have some for the panel. So we'll get started with Janet.
As he said, I'm a professor of history at the University of Dayton, and I teach actually American urban and technology history. But the technology that I focused on is the technology of aviation. And my main research interest is actually in the history of American airports. So more like the landing fields. And I have, though, also, I haven't written on them, but I have reviewed some articles that have been published very recently about the emerging spaceports, and convinced some of my colleagues in planning history that they really needed to pay attention to this phenomenon, which is beginning to occur in several states around the country, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Alaska, and so on. When I was asked to be on this panel, one of the questions I was told we'd be asked is aviation history repeating itself? Well, history doesn't repeat itself, but there are oftentimes very, very persistent ideas that await their time. And I was reminded of one of those in the last couple of weeks. I like a show called Eureka. It's on the Sci-Fi Channel. And in this year, the plot twist is that they went back to 1947 and then suddenly found themselves back in 2010 with this eminent scientist from 1947 who's kind of snuck his way along so he could see Eureka in the future. He said he'd someone who was chasing the future his whole life. And so he ends up in the town of Eureka in 2010, and his first reaction is disappointment. Because although Eureka has evolved from essentially a military tent city to a small town, it looks rather like a conventional small town. And he looks around, and then he looks up to the sky, and he says, "Where are the flying cars?" Which seems to be one of the more persistent ideas in aviation that comes up time and time again and is coming up again recently. And so be happy to talk to you about that kind of idea, or I have colleagues who have written about the idea of whether space is truly a frontier, or whether exploration is truly part of the human nature. So I look forward to talking with you this evening.
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for coming in. I literally just got in here, so I didn't get a chance to see any of the conference sessions so far. 2 points I wanted to bring across, or 2 questions I want to examine is, one, are we seeing really a rebirth or birth of a true entrepreneurial space industry? And 2, why should you care? The first is, to answer the first one, I think it's important to keep in mind that this is not the first time that there's been a surge in entrepreneurial companies trying to do space flight. If you go back to the 1980s, there were a number of companies that were attempting to do small launch vehicles in particular. In the late 90s, there were a surge in companies trying to do reusable launch vehicles to chase after the huge market of satellites that Iridium and Globalstar and Teledesic were going to darken the skies with. As you know, most of those companies didn't survive either of those situations. I think the thing that is different this time around is that we see different markets that these companies are going after. The first surges of real entrepreneurial space companies typically went after the conventional satellite launch markets or satellite application markets. Some of the most successful entrepreneurial space companies of the last few decades have been the ones that have gone after the markets. DirecTV and Dish, GOI and Digital Globe. Orbital Sciences is one example of a company that actually built hardware, launch vehicles and satellites, and have been successful doing so. But what you see with a lot of the new companies that are going around out there is they're going after new markets, in particular space tourism, but you're seeing a lot of microgravity research and other areas that suborbital companies in particular are going after. And also, in many respects, a lot of the technological obstacles that they have to overcome are a lot smaller. To do suborbital space flight, you're going up to 100 kilometers, maybe Mach 3 or Mach 4. The RLV companies like Kistler Aerospace and Kelly Space and Technology and the like in the late 90s were actually typically trying to achieve orbit Mach 25. A much more difficult technological obstacle to overcome, especially if you're trying to do a vehicle that's designed to be reusable and fly at a very high flight rate in order to make your economics work. So I think that's one thing that's different. The other question is, why should you care? And there are 2 answers to that. One is, I suspect a lot of people here are interested in going into space themselves. And maybe you're saving up your nickels and dimes and fives and tens and 20s to buy a flight on X-Corps or Virgin Galactic or something like that. Or maybe you're really saving your money up to fly to a Bigelow space station, but you want to fly to space yourselves, and you realize that you're probably not going to do so as a NASA astronaut. And that if you really want to experience space flight, it's going to have to be through the private sector to do so. But the other thing, even if you're not interested yourself in going into space, but you are interested in the goal of establishing human civilization on Mars, which I suspect everyone in this room would agree with, because that's why you're here, is that we really need some breakthroughs that some of these entrepreneurial companies are promising to reduce the cost of space access. because to really make a long-term, affordable, and sustainable exploration and settlement program work, we really have to reduce the cost of doing business in space. And that includes launch, but that includes all the other infrastructure and other operations that you need in low Earth orbit and beyond in order to make that sustainable. And with the current infrastructure that we have, that's difficult to do. And if you look at the policy situation in Washington, if you're going to Washington expecting a huge budget increase for NASA in order to do this, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in this environment, and it's certainly not going to happen 5 or 10 years down the road, where if you look at the fiscal trend lines, you're going to see a big budget crunch coming for this country, and you're going to see a lot of spending tightened down, and it's going to be very difficult in that sort of environment to justify any sort of budget increase for NASA, or even justify keeping NASA at its current level of about $20 billion a year to do so. So you need some sort of entrepreneurial efforts to help provide that lower cost access to space, to help provide that infrastructure upon which you can more affordably build exploration and settlement of Mars and the rest of the solar system. So I think that's the real reason why, regardless of what particular companies you like or in favor of, that we do need something that goes beyond the current paradigm of the large aerospace companies and the large government programs if we're really going to see in our lifetimes a real sustainable, affordable settlement of Mars.
Well, we'll start out with an apology. I'm not much of a speaker, and so to make sure we all get through the evening, I prepared some remarks, and so I'll be glancing at them. But first of all, I want to thank the Mars Society for holding its convention in Dayton. Dayton is known as an airplane town, not a space town, and yet the space program has roots in the Dayton area. The first astronauts did some of their training at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, but the region has made many other contributions to space exploration over the years. One of my favorites is the invention of the radioisotope generator that was patented by scientists at the Mound plant in Miamisburg, literally up the hill from where I live. Mound workers manufactured, assembled, and fueled the radioisotope heat sources and generators used in numerous manned and unplanned space missions, including the Voyager spacecraft that are still functioning after decades in orbit, or decades in space. More recently, some wind tunnel testing for a Mars airplane was done in the vertical wind tunnel at Wright-Patterson. And the batteries powering the Mars rovers resulted from a technology program by the Propulsion Directorate at the Air Force Research Laboratory, also at Wright-Patterson. I was born in Dayton and have spent most of my life here. From 1985 through 2006, I was the aviation writer for the Dayton Daily News and corresponded with Lyle and Tam and many others on various stories. I've always been a space buff, and I guess I have a confession to make. I ate space food sticks as a kid. I drank Tang from a plastic bag. And I would use any excuse to cover space stories at the newspaper. I've also authored a number of books, mainly children's books about aviation and space exploration. And just last week, I became editor-in-chief of a new annual magazine, Ohio Aerospace and Defense, which will promote Ohio's aerospace and defense industry to the world and even to Ohioans. This is a good year to have the Mars Society convention here because as the nation debates a new way forward, we hope it's forward in space, it's also marking the 100th anniversary of air shows in North America.